Hello, you are on the Ruslan Belov channel. On air is the daily review of combat operations on the Ukrainian front. You knew that Europe sometimes demonstrates strange decisions, didn't you? But have you ever wondered to what extent? Well, the day before yesterday, the head of European diplomacy, Kaja Kallas, stated that Europe intends to seek concessions from Russia within the framework of a possible peaceful settlement regarding Ukraine. And what concessions are we talking about? About the reduction of the Russian army. A logical question arises: what else, in the opinion of European politicians, should Russia do? Give up its nuclear potential? Sacrifice part of its territory? What is the logic behind such demands? It makes it seem as if Russia is the one in a losing position. In general, such statements look extremely detached from reality. Meanwhile, combat operations continue, and we continue to carefully analyze the situation together. So friends, we will begin today's episode with cautious optimism. The past 24 hours on the sectors of the new offensive by the armed forces of Ukraine passed relatively quietly. The Ukrainian side failed to achieve any new results, and they also failed to advance into the depth of the Russian defenses. On the western sector, relative stability generally remains. Moreover, the Russian army has certain successes there, but we will return to those a little later. Now about the north. Yesterday I told you that Oristopol was lost by the Russian army, and information was also spreading that the armed forces of Ukraine had allegedly returned Sosnovka under control. We are talking about precisely this settlement. However, these reports do not correspond to reality. Yes, indeed, Ukrainian units entered Sosnovka, but this happened not yesterday, but the day before yesterday, at the height of their offensive actions. At the same time, the entry was of a short-term nature. They were unable to gain a foothold in the settlement. They entered and soon left, without creating a sustainable presence. There are no Russian troops there either, so for the moment, Sosnovka remains a grey zone. From what can be noted regarding yesterday, the armed forces of Ukraine made attempts to attack Berezovoye. However, they never reached the village itself. They were stopped by Russian defensive positions north of the settlement. By the end of the day, the attacking groups were thrown back. At the same time, there is information that was practically not reported earlier. At the peak of the attacks 2 days ago, several Ukrainian assault groups on vehicles managed to drive all the way to Uspanovka. But it is important to understand, the mere fact that a separate mobile group was able to break through by car to Uspanovka does not mean at all that the entire territory north of it ended up under the control of the armed forces of Ukraine. That is not how it works right now. The front here is not continuous, it is sparse, and there are gaps between positions that can be utilized. Ukrainian units used the fog as cover, slipped between positions, and reached the northern hangars of Uspanovka. However, they were destroyed there. Yesterday, a similar fate befell another group on the approaches to Berezovoye, more precisely, north of the village, since they were never able to get close to it directly, running into fortifications. As a result, they failed to achieve a breakthrough. At the moment, the situation here has relatively stabilized, although, of course, time will show the development of events. Besides the northern sector, attacks continue from the west as well. The routes remain the same: Rozdestvenskoye and Ternovatoye. The day before, 2 more Ukrainian groups tried to enter in this direction, but were destroyed on the approach. The settlement itself remains in the grey zone for now, since there is no full control from the Russian side there either. From the direction of Vozdvijenka, an attempt was made to break through into Varvarovka. The logic is understandable. From Varvarovka, the path opens to Ravnopolye. However, here too, the attack was repelled. I will not claim that the situation is finally stabilized and all attacks have been repelled, and that Syrski's offensive has been completely stopped. Nevertheless, there are grounds for restrained optimism. I continue to maintain contact with units on the ground and will inform you as data becomes available. Now about the advances of the Russian army. And there indeed were some, and quite significant ones. In particular, in the Kupiansk direction, both on the right and on the left bank of the Oskol. On the right bank, Russian units advanced in Moskovka. They occupied and cleared the southern part of the village and also slightly expanded positions on the flanks, both from the west and from the east. This suggests that the offensive potential of the armed forces of Ukraine on Kupiansk is exhausted. Let me remind you that in one of the previous episodes, we analyzed the return of a street and a lane in the right bank part of Kupiansk under Russian control, as well as an advance along one more street. Now an advance in Moskovka has been added. The Russian army has switched to counterattacks, is returning positions and achieving success, while the armed forces of Ukraine are forced to switch to defense without achieving the key goal, taking Kupiansk. However, the most significant events are taking place on the left bank of the Oskol. Here, the armed forces of Ukraine are observing far more serious problems. We are essentially talking about a failure of the defense. Russian units advanced 5 kilometers 700 meters and reached the outskirts of Novusinov. For now, the storming of the village itself has not begun. Consolidation on the new lines is underway. But the key point lies elsewhere. From the current positions to Kovsharovka is only about 2.5 kilometers. And Kovsharovka, together with Kupiansk-Uzlovy, is a powerful defensive node of the armed forces of Ukraine on the left bank, due to dense multi-story buildings. Furthermore, the capture of Kovsharovka actually opens an exit to the rear of the Ukrainian garrison in Kupiansk-Uzlovy. The situation for Ukrainian forces on the left bank is deteriorating every day. If by summer it is possible to completely clear this bridgehead, including Kovsharovka, Novusinov, and Kupiansk-Uzlovy, then Kupiansk itself will be under threat of final loss. Another important advance occurred in the zone of responsibility of the Vostok Group. Russian units occupied the urban-type settlement of Zaliznichnye and cleared the pocket to the south. Previously, we discussed that it was precisely Zaliznichnye that was holding back further advancement to the west toward Orikiv. Now this obstacle has been removed. However, the question of the stability of control remains. We should wait for confirmations. We have already seen how, in the case of Ternovatoye, initial success was followed by a counterattack by the armed forces of Ukraine and the loss of positions. Serious enemy forces are concentrated here as well, and attempts to retake Zaliznichnye will almost certainly follow. Therefore, it will be possible to speak of full and final consolidation after the appearance of objective confirmations west of the settlement. A small advance was also recorded in the Orikiv direction. Units of the Dnieper Group previously entered Novoandreevka, and over the past 24 hours, the zone of control there was slightly expanded. However, serious breakthroughs should not be expected. The area is saturated with concrete fortifications, numerous strongholds, and minefields. The Russian army has essentially been here since 2022, and it has not yet been possible to pierce the defense from the south. Substantial changes are possible either upon the Dnieper Group coming out from the west, with the cutting of the key supply artery from Zaporozhye, or upon the approach of the Vostok Group from the east. Nevertheless, despite the activity of the armed forces of Ukraine, the Russian army maintains a sufficiently high tempo even in the winter period. Moving on to the Slavansk direction, active combat operations are recorded here in the areas of Minkovka and Golubovka. There are reports of the expansion of the zone of control in the vicinity of Privolye, advancement toward Bondanoye, and the straightening of the front line. Probably in the near future, the map will change in favor of the Russian side. Video materials confirming the advance were received from several points. On this sector, the entire designated territory is no longer under the control of the armed forces of Ukraine. Perhaps individual grey zones remain, but there is no sustainable presence of Ukrainian forces there. There is also information about actions north of Reznikovka, between Reznikovka and Platonovka. In addition, the Ukrainian resource deep state noted Nikiforovka as having almost completely passed under the control of Russian troops, and also recorded an advance along the Seversky-Donetsk Canal. According to reports from Russian sources, servicemen of the armed forces of the Russian Federation are occupying new positions along the Platonovka to Reznikovka line under enemy fire. The advance to the west of Seversk amounted to more than 1 kilometer. Thus, the zone of control to the west of Seversk is expanding. Judging by previous changes to the map, part of these positions might have already been occupied earlier, and new video materials only confirm the presence of Russian units. At the current moment, this is exactly how the situation looks in this sector. Fresh reports are coming from the Krasny Lyman direction. According to available data, the Ukrainian command has transferred significant combat-ready reserves here with the aim of organizing counterattacks toward Derilovo, in the direction of Stavki, and also to contain the advance of the Russian army directly on Lyman. Let me remind you that yesterday, video material from this sector was published, precisely from this point, confirming the advance of Russian units by approximately 2 kilometers, with subsequent consolidation in the settlement. Today, additional information appeared confirming the expansion of the control zone on this segment of the line of combat contact. Moreover, there are grounds to believe that the actual zone of control of Russian troops here is even wider than reflected on the map. It should be taken into account that the Lyman area is literally saturated with FPV crews on both sides. Drones are actively used both by Ukrainian units and by Russian ones, which seriously complicates any maneuvers. Nevertheless, given the current dynamics, one can say that the question of taking Lyman is, rather, a matter of time. The supply of the Ukrainian grouping here is effectively cut, and Russian forces continue their progressive advance in this direction. At the current moment, the situation looks exactly like this, moving further along the map. Updates are also coming from the Pokrovsk direction. Changes are recorded in the Grishino area. It is from here that the main reports are coming. According to available data, Russian troops are building up forces in the Pokrovsk-Mirnograd agglomeration. Concentration is taking place in 2 settlements at once, and at the same time, pressure directly on Grishino is increasing. It is not excluded that larger-scale assault actions will begin in the near future. At the same time, confirmations are coming in about the advance of Russian units inside Grishino itself. Previously, Ukrainian sources stated that the settlement was allegedly completely returned under their control, and Russian forces were knocked out of there. However, judging by current information, these statements did not correspond to reality. Although it cannot be ruled out that at a certain stage the situation did indeed change. The front line here is distinguished by high dynamics, especially on the Dobropoli salient. There are cases when Russian units occupy a settlement, establish control, after which the Ukrainian side conducts a counterattack, and the settlement changes hands again. But now data is coming in about the gradual expansion of the Russian army's control zone in this sector, moving on to the Dobropolye salient itself. Reports of changes are also arriving from here. In the center of attention is the settlement of Toretskoye. According to available information, Russian troops are making attempts to strengthen their positions in Toretskoye itself, as well as to expand control in the adjacent areas, advancing north of the settlement. In addition, information is being received about the conducting of clearing operations in the settlement of Novi Donbass. However, so far there is no clear understanding of whether the clearing is fully completed and whether it was possible to consolidate there finally. Previously, video materials repeatedly appeared confirming the presence of Russian units in this area, but information continues to come in that is contradictory. There are reports that Russian forces were forced to retreat under the pressure of a Ukrainian counterattack, with active use of FPV drones by the armed forces of Ukraine. Therefore, it is necessary to wait for additional confirmations here to correctly reflect the changes on the map and finally clarify the situation. Summarizing the results of the past 24 hours. 1 settlement passed under the control of Russian troops, as well as about 17 square kilometers of territory. Undoubtedly, we will continue to carefully monitor the sectors of offensive activity of the armed forces of Ukraine. And we are talking not only about the Zaporozhye direction. Yesterday, information appeared about attempts at offensive actions in the Lyman direction as well. The scales there are smaller, the intensity is lower, however the trend itself deserves attention. That is all I have regarding the current situation on the front. Now let's briefly go through the political agenda. Europe is sabotaging peace, stated the Russian permanent representative to the UN regarding negotiations on Ukraine. Europe is incapable of constructively participating in the settlement of the conflict in Ukraine. European countries are sabotaging peace initiatives, promoting a line on the continuation of the conflict, stated Vasily Nebenzia. In this regard, Europe has no moral right to be indignant about its exclusion from the negotiation process. Moscow consistently points to the destructive role of the EU, which is not interested in a real peace. Europe hardly has the moral right to make claims regarding its exclusion from negotiations, said the Russian permanent representative to the UN. The intra-European squabble regarding contacts with Moscow, when Macron says that one needs to communicate, while Merz says let Kiev communicate itself, is actually a very characteristic division. Macron, for all his comicality, represents France, a country which for the last 170 years had as its biggest contradiction with Russia the notorious Tsarist debts, which did not prevent excellent cooperation between Paris and Moscow, starting right from the 1920s. Sovereign cooperation. France avoids excessive integration into global structures. Germany, which emerged as a unified state in 1871, has as the main content of its history a global armed conflict from 1914 to 1945 with a 20-year truce. And in this conflict, Russia was Berlin's main adversary. As a result of the conflict, Germany lost sovereignty, and what Merz is saying now is the voice of precisely those structures. And they understand perfectly well there that a direct individual dialogue of European countries with Russia is an excellent way to resolve contradictions. But then these structures will not be needed. Therefore, they will push Ukraine out in front of themselves to war and do everything so that this war continues. Blocking possible normalization of relations, writes the Telegram channel Meister. Macron stated that Europe will be swept away in 5 years if it does not start resisting Trump. People are in despair. You no longer know how far the Americans are willing to go. It is not only about Greenland. In this phase, we are left to our own devices, stated the President of France in an interview with European newspapers. Between Moscow and Paris, there were contacts which, if desired, will help to quickly establish dialogue at the highest level, reported Peskov. The Kremlin paid attention to Macron's words about the necessity to establish relations with Russia. This appeals to Moscow. The Kremlin does not yet see signals that Paris has a desire to establish dialogue at the highest level. We are following the events, friends. Subscribe to our channel. Peace and goodness to everyone.